This is a chronology of events that I feel are relevant or had some degree of influence on the state of video games and electronic gaming today. This is not inclusive. This is not going to capture it all. Some people's favorite events won't be mentioned in here. This is going to be a work in progress. I'll continue to develop this timeline. What I want to highlight here is some of the major things that I feel led to the state of video gaming as it is today. And then I want you to keep in the back of your mind the previous presentation as we discussed the basic vocabulary and categorization and genres of games, how things along this timeline influenced that. So let's start off back here in the late 19th century. Parker Brothers, 1883, one of the major game firms was founded. Board games. Remember the categories from board games. I'm going to keep moving down the timeline here. Marconi patents the radio, 1896. H.G. Wells gives us War of the Worlds in 1898. Television was first proven to be effective in 1909, and the U.S. population in 1910 was 91 million people. It's a little happy face there. As the 20th century progresses, you're going to see more and more digital innovation. For example, color television and motion pictures with sound. You're going to see that in the late 1920s. Computers are starting to come into effect. The first analog computer that's of major import is something called the differential analyzer. The board game Monopoly was brought into the market in 1935. The next analog computer, the Harvard Mark I, of substantial import to me, 1939 all the way out to 1944. This is a large development. And really the first major digital computing infrastructure was created in 1943. This was created in England. And at that time in the 1940s, the U.S. population had grown to 130 million people. ENIAC, Mattel in the 1940s. The transistor, this is a major part of video gaming today, 1947. The whole point of some of these computer population and game statements on the chronological timeline is that these are the things that make games accessible to mass amounts of people. Low-cost consumer electronics. A population that is largely connected. According to the Pew Internet Trust studies, we have broadband adoption in the United States north of 70% and rising. People will more and more have access to Internet connectivity. But these transistors and major developments in networking and in the population growth, as the population grew larger, more wealthy, with greater access to consumer technology that was cost effective, more and more people have the ability to participate in these games, because these games that I'm showing you, starting in the 1950s, this is when the generation of video games and computers really got kicked off. The average person could not afford to build a computer even in their garage. Even if they were a wealthy oil tycoon, they would probably not want to spend the money for what they would get out of the computer. So this 1950s period is what I consider the start of the period of computing and video games. So notice that Buck Rogers, 1950, a major science fiction influence in Buck Rogers. That was much earlier than that, but that was one of the first episodes that you see in mainstream television. Fellowship of the Ring, something we study in our course. 1954, at the same time, the IBM 650, one of the IBM major predecessors to the mainframe, were brought to market. Digital Electronics Corporation, a major firm, started to come into the market in the late 1950s. And here's one of the first video games that I can find on record. Is something called Tennis for Two. And I've seen some earlier tic-tac-toe and other games played with oscilloscopes. Tennis for Two was a great example of what video games were going to be like in future. The mini-computer market, as these IBM 650s would take up rooms of space, the mini-computers, they would take up the equivalent of a large desk in your dorm room today, or in your house or office. And the Mini TDP-1 was a predecessor of something that was very important. The Game of Life came out in 1960. And then some of the references you see in Jesper Jewell, Spaceboard, 1962. This is one of the first video games that you'll see as well. Now, this is going to get very crowded in here, so I'm not going to go through all of these. However, I will show you the ones with flags on them. These are the ones that I feel are very, very important to us. Tandy Corporation buys Radio Shack. Radio Shack personally had a major influence on me. My first computer was a TRS-80 color computer, and I had a lot of training on the TRS-80 Model 1s and Model 3s down in Sarasota, Florida. So this was a very important firm for me. And things that really made gaming accessible, and this is how I personally got into gaming, was a basic language. On my TRS-80 color computer, beginner's all-purpose symbolic instruction code. Instead of crossing wires and putting in punch cards, you could actually use a keyboard using BASIC to do some very basic if-then loop statements and other digital logic, which help make gaming and programming gaming more accessible. One of the first things I programmed was a program called Hammurabi. It was probably 150 lines of code that you were the king, and the king had to apportion food and money and protection to his subjects, and if you didn't do that in appropriate proportions, you were going to lose the game. And it was an all-text game written in BASIC on the TRS-80 color computer. The IBM 360, this is the predecessor to the mainframe Z series today, was built in 1965. So remember, 65 is not a long time ago. It's about 42 years ago from the point of this recording. So it's a very important time frame for us in the 1960s and early 70s. One of the major milestones, I probably should have put a flag here, was Star Trek. This had a major, phenomenal influence on people. 1966, Star Trek, with Captain James T. Kirk and Mr. Spock came into existence. These two fellas and their adventures, and this is this quest romance idea, they were questing every episode. They were questing after something by and large, facing some interesting problem in a faraway land. A lot of the Star Trek and Gene Roddenberry came out of this Western idea. Leonard Nimoy, Mr. Spock, believe it or not, was actually in a great deal of Westerns prior to starring in the Star Trek series. Population in the 1970s, the United States, 203 million happy people, according to my smiley face here. ARPANET. This is the predecessor to the Internet. We didn't have any large-scale capability for networking in North America until after 1969 and into the 1970s, and even then it was primarily centered around labs. Now, the thing I want you to notice is that suddenly, in the 1970s and 1980s, there is a huge amount of innovation. The 1970s is a major turning point for consumer electronics. You're seeing firms, and this is something that Steve Jobs of Apple fame was involved in, Atari, the Magnavox Odyssey, Pong. Pong was a major Atari production. That's the thing that Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs were involved in bringing to market. Bob Metcalfe, and this is a very major date for us, in the early 1970s, 1973, brought Ethernet to market. TSR, a guy named Gary Gygax, who produced a wonderful game called Dungeons and Dragons. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the class and in other areas of our discussion, how Dungeons and Dragons was directly influenced by Tolkien, and how Dungeons and Dragons, the mechanics of that role-playing game, came to be a major part of the mechanics of most games that you see, such as World of Warcraft, Dark Age of Camelot, Lord of the Rings Online, and the fantasy role-playing genre. Another amazing game here, which is very important to us in the mid-1970s, is called Adventure. TCP/IP, the protocol that allows internetworking to occur, was not really widespread and tested until 1975. Now notice I'm going to have to go up a little bit here, so bear with me. Infocom, and this is a game that you would have seen earlier, produced something called Zork, a text-based adventure that was widely available. And one of our favorite firms down here, check my arrow, is Microsoft. So Microsoft got started building a BASIC compiler for the Altair, and this was a home kit computer. And so now you have a firm, and they were in Arizona at the time, you have a firm that was creating a BASIC compiler for a hobbyist computing environment in people's garages. So this was an amazing time with a great deal of innovation. And the key thing I want you to note here is that all of these firms, except for perhaps Ethernet and Bob Metcalfe, because Bob worked at Xerox PARC, a lot of this was individual academics or small firms or small production studios, and this is particularly true with Ultima. Ultima was produced by a one-man shop. He did all the writing, the graphics, the programming all in one. TRS-80 model came out right here in the late 70s along with a wonderful board game by Avalon Hill called Squad Leader. The Apple II, the second Apple that came out from Steve Jobs, was also there. VHS recording came out in, looks to be the mid to late 70s, 1976. You see this Ibm Pc, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, coming into the market. All of these things here, the important thing to note: Pac-Man, the Atari 800, Space Invaders, Game Designer's Workshop. These are either role-playing games, major game firms that last today, or were acquired by Hasbro and Mattel. Whatever the case is, Namco's Pac-Man was an arcade game of great fame. All of these happened in the 1970s. So you see more and more technical progression over time. Now, one of the interesting things here is, of all this scientific and computer innovation, Tron came out in 1982, I believe. Looking at all the things that happened in 1982, and as did Conan the Barbarian. So still a lot of fantasy influence in entertainment. And then we have this huge computer influence in Tron. Tron is actually, in BASIC and in other languages, a debugging tool called Trace On. That's what Tron stands for in the technical world. So the name of the movie actually derives from all of this Altair, Microsoft, basic language constructs. So you start to see at this time a lot of the technological innovations, the myth around it, and the ideas and speculation around it entering into our fiction and into our creative lives. The IBM PC, which was a major event, in addition to the Atari 2600, which was our first substantial consumer console, the IBM PC was developed and produced in August of 1981. The Atari 2600 is in 1977. So you're seeing a tremendous amount of innovation in that 1970s period of time into the 1980s. And just have a look at, take a moment to look at some of these interesting events. One major event, which was earth-changing, that I forgot to mention here. I was born, so you understand where your professor was born as I relate this. Same time ARPANET was born, 1969, March of 1969, so give you a sense of where your teaching population is at this particular moment. Now I put the Atari 1040 ST. This is a beautiful piece of equipment. This is fantastic graphics. I owned one of these in 1985. Same time the Commodore Amiga was out, the Atari 1040 ST, they were competitors. Great competition between the two of them. I loved my Atari 1040 ST. I thought I was the king of the world when I got it, and that was the same time that Nintendo released its NES. Activision was out. Final Fantasy made its release in 1987. And then from what I can tell, if I'm not mistaken, the undergraduate class who's going to graduate in 2011 was generally born around 1989. So you were born into a world. Now look to the left of your world right here. This is your world, 1989. You never lived in a world without all of this innovation having been in place. However, look at me. Let's go back a second. This is where I came into the world. The most advanced thing that was happening was the IBM 360 and Star Trek. And in the 1970s, you had 203 million happy people. So think about that for a moment, too. You never lived in a world that didn't have all of this innovation. You never lived in a world that didn't have Conan the Barbarian, the movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger in it. However, it wasn't until 1990s that HTTP really got started, the Sega Genesis. Two major games that were brought out on the PC. Myst and Doom. Now, Myst was an adventure game, but it had great renown for 3D graphics. Doom was the first substantial first-person shooter. We're going to be reading this book, Snow Crash, but you can see how Snow Crash was influenced by the previous technological and social innovations. One of my favorite shows, Babylon 5, came out in 1995, a wonderful series. Ultima Online, this is really when you're starting to take this fantasy role-playing game, you've got internet connectivity and modem connectivity. 1997, it starts to become viable to have online role-playing games. EverQuest comes out. Another major role-playing game online. So you're seeing some amazing things happening. 281 million people in the year 2000, 302 million in the year 2007. That's the release of Lord of the Rings Online. World of Warcraft coming out in 2004. By the end of 2007, or where we're at right now, they have over 9 million worldwide subscribers. So this is a phenomenal set of events that have occurred, and it doesn't. This in no way scratches the surface, but it does give you a brief framework to consider all of the technological, literary, social, and other innovations that led us to the state of gaming as of today.